Have you ever wondered why a man retreats into silence just when the conversation begins to pierce the surface? Why his voice, once eager and open, suddenly becomes a wall of unspoken things you can feel but not touch? This silence is not empty. It is not a lack. It is not a void that needs filling. No. His silence is architecture, a fortress built not with intention, but with fear. Not because he has nothing to say, but because he is afraid of what the truth will reveal, afraid of what your eyes might expose if he speaks too clearly. Because in the heart of every man who falls silent, there is a child, aching to be seen, yet terrified of exposure. Carl Jung taught that the unconscious is not just a dark abyss of forgotten memories, but a sacred reservoir of all we suppress, deny, and project. And in the silence of a man, you will often find the echoes of his own unhealed shadow. It is in silence that the mask slips, not to reveal the man, but the boy behind him. The boy who was taught that emotion was weakness, the boy who watched love be withheld when he cried too loudly, the boy who learned that being stoic kept him safe from shame. And so, the man you see before you now does not speak, not because he has mastered self-control, but because his ego trembles at the thought of being known, truly known. To be seen in his emotional nakedness would be unbearable, not because you would wound him, but because he never learned how to hold himself when he is vulnerable. He would rather be misunderstood than be transparent, because misunderstanding allows him to stay in control. Silence lets him escape accountability, and distance keeps him feeling powerful, even as he quietly drowns. But here's the paradox. What he hides in silence is not strength. It is fragility dressed in armor. It is ego protecting the wound. And you feel it. You've felt the way the ire changes when he disappears into himself, the way your own intuition sharpens around his absence. You start to question if you're imagining it, if you're asking too much, if your emotional presence is too loud for his stillness. But what if I told you that it's not you that's too much, it's his capacity that's too little? You are not being too emotional, you are standing at the gates of a man's emotional immaturity and knocking, but no one answers. Because his silence is not a locked door, it is a mirror, and in that mirror, you are not just witnessing his fear, you are confronting your own. The fear that maybe love means waiting, that maybe love means shrinking, that maybe love means translating silence into meaning, hoping to be enough for a man who does not yet understand himself. But let's be clear, silence is not the same as peace. Stillness is not the same as presence. A man who cannot articulate his soul does not get to expect you to read it. Because this is the truth behind his silence. It is a strategy, a retreat, a means of staying in power while avoiding intimacy. To be in love with a man like this is to dance with a ghost, to touch the outline of a body that is present but never fully there. And yet the silence is seductive, because silence invites you to fill in the blanks. It hands you the pen and says, "Write me into something worthy." You begin to romanticize the distance. You mistake his avoidance for mystery, his lack of communication for emotional depth. You imagine that if you're just patient enough, loving enough, soft enough, he will rise to meet you. But he won't. Not until he learns that his silence is not noble. It is avoidance. Not until he sees that his retreat is not masculine, it is protection. Not until he does the shadow work required to meet his own vulnerability head-on. A man's silence can be a poem, yes, but only when it is chosen from wholeness, when it is rooted in presence, not in fear, when it becomes a sacred space between two souls, not a canyon created by emotional neglect. Because the silence of a wounded man is not absence, it is noise, loud with every unresolved wound, every withheld apology, every buried emotion he never dared to name. And until he names them, until he claims them, he will speak in the only language he knows, silence, boo, to you. You are not obligated to translate it. You are not here to decode silence into love. You are here to be met, not managed, to be felt, not figured out. And the moment you stop mistaking his quiet for depth is the moment you begin to hear the sound of your own worth. rising. But there is another truth, deeper still, a truth that lingers beneath the archetype of the silent man. One Carl Jung so often spoke of in veiled metaphors and myths, the battle between persona and shadow. A man's silence is not always malicious. Sometimes it is the sound of internal war. His persona, the curated version of himself he offers to the world, stands polished and unthreatened. It smiles, works, laughs on cue. It says all the right things. But the shadow, the repressed, neglected, abandoned aspects of who he really is, that shadow lives just behind his silence, watching, waiting to be acknowledged. This is why he flinches at emotional honesty, why he tenses when you ask him, "What are you feeling?" Why he vanishes when you touch the part of him that is still bleeding. To answer you truthfully would mean allowing his persona to crumble, and without it, he fears he is nothing, because the modern man is taught to build, to conquer, to suppress, but he is not taught to feel. And so he doesn't just silence his voice, he silences his truth. And in that silence, the unconscious takes over. He becomes passive-aggressive, cold, disconnected, or worse, he smiles and pretends all is well, while you slowly begin to feel insane. Because you're not reacting to his words, you're reacting to the absence of them, to the weight of what he cannot say, but you know lives behind his eyes. The feminine is intuitive. She senses energy before it becomes language. She feels shifts in tone, tension in breath, shadows in spaces where love used to live. You begin to carry his unspoken pain as if it's your own. You apologize for needs that haven't even been expressed. You lower your volume to meet his discomfort. But here's where the unconscious dance begins. He withdraws to maintain control, and you overextend to keep connection. He becomes colder, and you become warmer. He offers distance, and you offer understanding. Until suddenly, you're no longer partners. You're opposites in orbit, feeding each other's wounds in silence. This is not love. This is trauma reenactment masquerading as compatibility. And if you trace the roots of this pattern, you will often find a wound, sometimes maternal, sometimes paternal, always unspoken. A man who was never taught to hold space for his own emotions cannot hold space for yours. He may crave you deeply. He may love your softness, your fire, your chaos, your clarity, but he cannot receive you, not as you are. Because to truly receive the feminine, emotionally, spiritually, erotically, a man must first be at peace with his own inner feminine. He must have walked through the valley of his own emotional landscape and returned whole. He must have touched his grief without running, sat with his guilt without numbing, looked his shame in the eye and said, "I see you, I accept you." Until then, his silence will always be armor, not art. And you must stop trying to be the balm for wounds you didn't cause. You are not the mother who heals the abandoned boy. You are the woman who sees the man he could become, but refuses to shrink to make him feel safe in his immaturity. Let him confront his silence. Let him meet the ghost in his own mirror. You are not required to interpret every withdrawal as mystery. You are not required to make excuses for his inability to express. And no, his silence is not your fault. It is the sound of his soul asking him to listen, to feel, to grow. And if he won't? If he chooses to stay silent, to stay small, to stay hidden, that is his journey. But you are not meant to wait in the shadows of someone else's self-abandonment. You are meant to rise, to walk away, not in anger, but in clarity, to release the man who only ever offers fragments of himself. Because you deserve to be loved out loud. And yet, so many women stay, not because they are weak, but because their strength has been conditioned into endurance instead of discernment. They believe that if they are just a little more patient, a little more understanding, a little less expressive, then maybe, just maybe, the silence will crack. Maybe he'll finally speak the words she's been aching to hear. But here's the bitter truth. Silence does not always mean depth. Sometimes it means avoidance. And a woman who is deeply emotional, spiritually awakened, and attuned to the unseen layers of intimacy will often fall hardest for the man who feels like a mystery. Because mystery, when misread, can feel like magnetism. But magnetism without reciprocity is spiritual erosion. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And this is how it plays out. Women mistake emotional unavailability for stoicism and mislabel a man's internal chaos as masculine composure. But silence is not always sacred. Sometimes it's the tomb of connection. And yet, a woman with a healing heart often believes it's her duty to be the cure. She sees his withdrawn nature as a puzzle to be solved, when in truth, it's a fortress built by fear, a fear of vulnerability, of being known, of surrendering control. And when that fear is stronger than his desire to grow, it becomes cruelty masked as passivity. He won't shout, but he'll starve you of attention. He won't fight, but he'll freeze every moment you need him to lean in. He won't lie, but he'll withhold truths you deserve to know. This kind of silence is more dangerous than rage, because at least rage acknowledges you exist. At least it says, "You moved me." Silence, on the other hand, says, "You're not even worth the echo." And this, right here, is where the feminine must awaken, not into more understanding, but into self-respect. Because you were not created to beg for language in a place where your soul already speaks fluently. You were not made to burn quietly while a man fumbles in his darkness, unwilling to light a match. And make no mistake, he knows. He knows the distance, he feels the silence too. But what he does with that knowing is the entire difference between a boy afraid of emotion and a man willing to be forged by it. A conscious man will use silence to reflect. An unconscious man will use it to punish. One moves toward you when ready, the other moves away, hoping you chase. And you must ask yourself, how long will you keep filling the space he refuses to enter? Because in every relationship built on imbalance, the feminine begins to carry the weight of the masculine's denial. She softens when she should stand tall, she gives when she should guard, she stays quiet when her soul is screaming to be heard. But your silence too has power. There comes a time when a woman stops explaining, stops begging, stops dancing around his discomfort like a flame trying not to burn too brightly. And in that silence, something radical begins to emerge. Not the hope that he will change, but the clarity that you already have. Your silence can become sanctuary instead of surrender, a space where you return to your intuition, where you stop decoding mixed signals and start listening to your own, where you realize love is not supposed to feel like solving a riddle you never agreed to play. So when a man hides behind his silence, you don't scream to be heard. You don't break yourself into softer syllables just to make it easier for him to listen. You pause, you breathe, you choose. Because feminine power is not found in how well you wait, but in how clearly you walk away when your worth is not recognized. The feminine psyche, in its awakened form, does not chase silence hoping for noise. She does not throw her voice into the void, praying for echoes. She becomes the void, deep, endless, mysterious, not to confuse, but to contain. She understands that real connection is not forged in the absence of conflict, but in the presence of courageous truth. Carl Jung taught that within every woman lies her animus, the masculine within, and within every man, his anima, the feminine. But when a man represses his anima, he cannot meet a woman in emotional depth. Her tears confuse him, her intuition frightens him, her needs feel like accusations rather than invitations to bond. So he retreats, not always in anger, but in ghostly withdrawal. His silence, then, is not noble, it is a mirror of his fracture. The unfinished boy in a man's body, still terrified of being seen and found wanting. Not because you demand too much, but because your very presence threatens the walls he built to feel safe. But the woman who is rooted in her value does not shrink herself just to fit inside his limited capacity. She does not water down her soul so he can feel like more of a man. She does not apologize for needing honesty, clarity, or warmth. She becomes a mirror too. And this is where the sacred dance begins to shift. Because when a man sees himself reflected in the unwavering gaze of a conscious woman, a woman who refuses to be gaslit by his coldness, who no longer clings to the fantasy of his potential, he has two choices, rise or retreat, and both answers are sacred. If he rises, he begins the painful but liberating journey of integration. Meeting the shadow he's been avoiding, the one that tells him it's weak to feel, that it's dangerous to open, that real love is too costly, that intimacy is exposure, and exposure is death. This man may fall apart before he steps forward, but he will arrive, honest, trembling, worthy. If he retreats, he confirms what the feminine always knew, that he was never ready for her depth, only intoxicated by her glow. So when a woman stops taking a man's silence personally, she reclaims her sanity. She stops dancing in confusion. She stops writing love poems in a language he has no intention of learning. She understands that silence is not neutral. It speaks. And what it says is this: I am not available. Not emotionally, not spiritually, not as an equal. And you, the woman listening now, must hear it clearly, not with fear, but with freedom. For too long, the feminine has been told that to be loved, she must be quieter, softer, smaller, that her ability to endure emotional starvation is a badge of honor, that the man who runs is somehow more powerful than the woman who stays. But no more. Silence is not a test to pass, it is a truth to witness. If a man chooses it instead of connection, you let him. Not because you are unworthy, but because you've stopped investing your light in people who fear their own reflection in it. Let him stay silent. Let him hide. Let him wither behind walls he won't tear down. And you rise, you thrive, you speak, not in desperation, but in divine discernment. You see, the most dangerous woman is not the one who cries when a man withdraws. She is the one who pauses, smiles, and says nothing, not because she is afraid, but because she finally understands. No response is still a response. And sometimes, silence isn't just avoidance. It's closure. There is a sacred stillness that lives inside the woman who has learned to no longer beg for words from a man drowning in his own. She no longer tries to decode the silence, she embodies it. She doesn't demand his emotional literacy because she's become fluent in the language of energy, vibration, and unspoken truth. When she walks away, it's not with bitterness, it's not to punish him or to incite regret. It is the quiet elegance of a woman who no longer needs validation from the wounded masculine. She understands now his silence was never hers to fix, it was his to face, and she will not be the caretaker of his emotional avoidance any longer. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." A man's silence is often the unconscious screaming to be heard. Years of shame, rejection, abandonment, all layered beneath a calm exterior. But the woman is not here to excavate his demons for him. She is not his therapist, his mother, or his emotional crutch. She is a portal, a mirror, a catalyst. Her presence can stir the deepest parts of him, but she will not drag him into transformation. That is his initiation, and he must choose it willingly. And when he doesn't, she grieves, not just for the man, but for the illusion, for the potential, for the story she wrote in her mind, the one where he would finally wake up, finally fight for her, finally speak what his heart could never utter. She lays it down with grace, honoring the love that was felt, even if it was never spoken. And still, she walks. Not because she's cold, but because she's done waiting for warmth from a soul afraid of his own fire. The woman who walks away from a man's silence does not lose, she liberates. She is no longer held hostage by the echoes of unspoken promises. She no longer spins in the whirlpool of mixed signals and delayed replies. She no longer makes excuses for a man whose energy has already told her everything his mouth won't. And this is the moment her power returns, not in volume, but in clarity, not in chasing, but in choosing. Because the empowered feminine knows that presence is everything. A man's body without his soul is not intimacy, it's absence wearing a mask. His touch means nothing if it's not backed by truth. His words mean little if his actions wither into silence the moment discomfort arises. So she stops performing. She stops auditioning for love in theaters of emotional scarcity. She returns to herself, whole, wild, undiluted. And from this place she no longer fears silence, because she's made peace with her own. She knows that the man who is truly ready for her won't need to disappear to find himself. He will bring his darkness to the table, not to shame her, but to share it, not to test her strength, but to match it. And if he cannot, she no longer breaks. She bows to the lesson, to the pain, to the knowing. Because a man's silence may hide 1,000 wounds, but a woman's silence, that is rebirth. That is the sound of her rising, not in rage, but in remembrance. Remembrance of who she was before she dimmed her voice to keep a connection alive. Remembrance of the fire that flickers in her chest when she's aligned with her truth. Remembrance that she was never meant to shrink to fit someone else's capacity to love. The woman who understands what a man hides behind his silence does not chase him through shadows. She lights her own path. And if he ever learns to meet her there, in full presence, with full voice, it will not be because she begged. It will be because she became. And what does she become? Not the woman who waits, not the woman who begs, not even the woman who needs to be understood. She becomes the woman who knows, with the quiet, devastating certainty of the feminine who has danced with her own shadow and lived to tell the tale. Because she has seen it all before, the man who disappears mid-sentence, the one who stares with longing but says nothing, the one who wraps his detachment in politeness and calls it not wanting to hurt you, the one who keeps the door slightly open only to never step through it himself. She's felt the invisible ache of being emotionally starved in someone else's presence. She's been the echo chamber for men who do not yet understand the sound of their own hearts. But now, she doesn't carry the silence like a wound. She carries it like armor. She recognizes it not as rejection, but redirection. She sees that his silence is not a mirror of her worth, but a reflection of his inner war. And she chooses not to enlist in battles that were never hers to fight. You see, when a man retreats into silence, he often believes he is protecting something, his pride, his control, his wounds. But what he loses is the only thing that ever truly wanted to meet him where he was, the woman willing to hold space for him without fixing, without rescuing, without shrinking herself to be palatable. But she cannot wait there forever. She cannot stand still in someone else's limbo, because the feminine was never designed to wait. She was designed to flow, to rise, to pulse like moonlight through the cracks of her own becoming. She has outgrown the role of emotional translator. She has outgrown the waiting room of potential. She is no longer interested in deciphering breadcrumb behavior. And when she stops trying to interpret his silence, she hears something even louder, her intuition, that ancient, sacred voice within her that whispers, "You were never meant to stay where love does not speak." Because love doesn't hide in silence. Love is not afraid of vulnerability. Love does not withhold communication like a weapon or a test. And she, the awakened woman, no longer settles for anything less. The tragedy for him is not that she leaves, it's that he never truly saw her until she was gone. It's that he mistook her stillness for weakness, her calm for indifference, her boundaries for punishment. He confused her grace for silence, when in truth it was restraint, discipline, dignity. And by the time he realizes the depth of what he silenced in her, it is often too late, because the woman who walked away is no longer the woman who once waited. She has become sovereign. She has burned the story that begged for his presence and rewritten one that doesn't center him at all. And in that fire she found herself, not in pieces, but in her wholeness. A man may hide his chaos in silence, but a woman will find her peace in hers. And that peace, it is unshakable. She no longer explains her intuition. She no longer justifies her standards. She no longer apologizes for being too much for men who are too little. Instead, she lives, fully, powerfully, undeniably. And the silence that once kept her trapped has become the silence that sets her free. Because once a woman understands that the silence of a man says more than his words ever could, she no longer fears the quiet. She becomes the storm it cannot silence. She becomes the woman the silence warned him about, not out of vengeance, but out of vision. She doesn't return to the man who couldn't find the courage to speak, not because she hates him, but because she has finally spoken to herself in ways he never did. In that sacred conversation between her wounds and her wisdom, she found what he withheld: honesty, closure, clarity. He thought silence would protect him from accountability, but silence to the feminine is never empty. It is space, and space to a healed woman is an invitation, not to wait, but to rise. Because while a man may use silence to delay the inevitable, a woman uses it to evolve. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." She has made the unconscious conscious. She no longer interprets his retreat as her rejection. She now sees it as the shadow of the masculine in flight, afraid not of her, but of himself. And while he wrestles with that shadow, she is no longer standing in the ring. She is gone, not with noise, not with fury, but with reverence. A clean break, a soft goodbye sealed in her own becoming. He will remember her, not because she begged to be remembered, but because she held his silence up like a mirror and walked away when he refused to look. And he may chase later, when the silence becomes too loud, when no one else touches the parts she touched without laying a hand. When every other woman reminds him of the one who left, not because she wasn't enough, but because he couldn't meet her there. But by then, she has become the woman who doesn't answer knocks from doors she had to close herself, because something shifted, in her cells, in her stance, in her soul. She no longer sees men as puzzles to solve or broken boys to rescue. She sees them as sovereign beings with choices, and she no longer waits to be chosen. She is the chooser now. She walks into rooms differently, not with performance but with presence. She doesn't speak to be heard, she speaks to be felt. She doesn't seduce, she summons. Not with charm but with certainty, not with need, but with knowing. Because the woman who has walked through the forest of a man's silence and survived no longer fears being alone. She understands that solitude is not punishment. It is prophecy. It is where the feminine heals. It is where she hears herself. It is where she writes new blueprints for what she will never accept again. So when you ask, what does a man hide behind his silence? The answer is himself. His fear of intimacy, his unprocessed trauma, his inability to be witnessed in imperfection, his attachment to power without presence, his craving to be understood without ever offering understanding. But when a woman walks away from that silence, she doesn't walk away from love. She walks toward a deeper one, a love that speaks, a love that sees, a love that isn't afraid of the storm she brings because it knows the storm is holy, a love that doesn't flinch at her fire because it's been forged in its own. That kind of love cannot come from a man who hides. It comes from the one who meets, and until then, she waits for no one. She breathes in her own worth like oxygen. She becomes the cathedral in which her own prayers echo. She builds a life so sacred that silence becomes not absence, but sanctuary. The man who once hid in silence will one day wish he had spoken, not to win her back, but to become the kind of man worthy of her stillness. But by then, the woman has become the answer to her own question. The silence doesn't scare her anymore. She is the silence now, deep, holy, untouchable. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses,